So, good morning, everybody. It is May 8th, and it's 9:02 a.m. East Coast time, 6:02 a.m. here in Arizona. I literally had to relocate. I was sitting at my kitchen table, and the sun has now moved so far that it was hitting me in the face, and it was awful. I couldn't get rid of it, so I relocated back over here into my laundry so that I don't get all of that bright morning sunshine. So anyway, I presume we will have other people joining us. Hopefully we can get through all of this in time. But for this morning's session, I wanted us to focus on, just so everybody knows, I have obtained a study guide for the Security Plus, the 601 Security Plus, and I'm going to start trying to make sure that whatever we're discussing aligns directly with the security guide, the study guide, so that you can take to the bank the stuff that we're discussing as being relevant to your studies for your Security Plus. It is important to note that almost every certification exam has to limit itself somehow. So, for example, there may be things that are absolutely essential for, like the CISSP, that are absolutely ignored in Security Plus, or vice versa. Things that Security Plus believes are important, but CISSP doesn't. That is just a product of the certification cycle. If you want to think about it, they have to test something. So they lay out the boundaries of what they're going to test, put it into their study guides, and that's what they teach to, that's what they put in their study guides, etc. So I have determined, we've decided here that our focus is on the base level security certification, and that's Security Plus. As you saw last week when we talked about the CISA, that is probably one step above Security Plus also after you've been in the career field for a little while, a couple of years. CISA is a good, CISA Plus, sorry, is a good certification to go for, but it's not a good entry-level cert. So Security Plus is the entry-level cert that we're sort of focusing on here. We will talk about those others, but if you are searching for your own certification training, we are compatible with Security Plus. I guess that's a way to say it. Make sense, Chris?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I wanted to talk about mobile devices, and the reason that I brought it up is that there was a article that I read that showed that the Department of Defense was working with Microsoft and had developed what they called DoD 365, which was literally a version of Microsoft Office 365, which is cloud-based office automation suite, but having tighter security controls. So they dubbed it DoD 365. Now, I'm sure that other groups could apply for and obtain licensing for DoD 365. However, you're probably going to have to pay more for it because it is Office 365 that has had advanced security controls mandated by the DoD incorporated into it. So just so you know, there is something out there, another Microsoft product called DoD 365. And that brought up the idea of when you go, I'll just use this as my mobile device for the day. Let's say I've got an iPad, and I'm at a symposium for the Department of Defense, and they say, well, you can get to our information, if you are DoD 365 compatible, and, how does that work? So I wanted to talk about mobile devices because they are absolutely something that has to be accounted for when you're designing your security infrastructure. If you don't, you are not accounting for real life. Real life occurs when, like we had for the presidential transitions, when somebody, your brand new secretary of whatever walks in the door and says, okay, where's my Mac? And you have to find a way to politely inform him or her that your environment is not certified for Macs or whatever. So Macs are reality and mobile devices are reality. So let's talk about mobile device deployment and management options. And again, this comes from the Security Plus study guide. So there are various types of options out there. The most prevalent is a lot of people, well, there are two, and the one is down at the very bottom, corporate-owned, agency-owned, or bring your own device. And the other two fit somewhere in between those two. So let's start with bring your own device, or BYOD. Basically what it means is that I arrive at my new job, I arrive at my new federal employment or whatever, my workplace, and they allow for my device to be securely connected and managed so that I can do work for wherever I'm at, but using my personally owned device. So for example, a BYOD approach says that the users own their devices, but the users then are also responsible to maintain their devices. The organization or entity or whatever you're connecting to does not take the responsibility of now managing and maintaining your device. All right? So in a true BYOD environment, if I connect to it, the BYOD environment has to accept what I have or set controls. And we'll talk about some of those controls as we move on. But here's the description that I have. The user brings their own personally owned device. This provides more user freedom and lower costs to the organization. Why? Because they don't have to buy devices. But there's a greater risk since the organization doesn't control, secure, or manage the devices. And in short, it provides less security and organization and oversight for the organization. So, Chris, have you had experiences with BYOD devices?
Not in a corporate capacity, corporate being government agency capacity. Mm-hmm. I've read some things about it. I am aware it's there. A lot of the agencies are tentative about it, and they still discuss it left and right. They would rather have it be down further when we talk further about the other categories, probably more towards the COPE and the corporate-owned, agency-owned area. Right. That's the ones I'm experienced and more familiar with.
Right, and there's probably some very good reasons why with your background. But let's take a thought into, for example, a medical network. Medical networks are required to have HIPAA protection, so they are pretty strict for adherence as well. And that's why, for example, you have, if you've ever been in a hospital room or something and the nurse or the doctor or the technician comes in and their device rings, you notice that all the rings sound the same. The reason is they have opted to use provided devices for their organization's network. And yet, while you're there visiting your sick uncle, you're allowed to connect into what's called the guest wireless. And so that's one of the ways that organizations do it is they say, we will provide guest internet, but the business side is only protected by and managed by and devices provided by us. And so you couldn't take your privately owned device and connect into a HIPAA-protected network using that approach. So that's not a BYOD approach. Some people say, well, I'm using my device, but you're using it for internet. And I don't know if you've ever tried this or seen this, but let's say you want to go to connect to your local gun shop. Believe it or not, gun shops are one of the 26 or 27 protected areas that Cisco has determined are what are candidates for exclusion. Just so you know. Also, websites that talk about abortion or this sort of thing, you're not allowed to talk about them. You're not allowed to connect to them. You're not allowed to use them when you're on some of these corporate protected environments. So when you are, let's say you're in your, Sickles hospital room, and you're using your iPad that you just use to do your university homework or whatever, and then you say, well, I want to go find out the current state of what's the group called, whatever the abortion rights agency groups are, or that sort of thing, and all of a sudden your hospital says you're not allowed to connect to this because it meets certain criteria. So yes, they offer guest access, but that guest access is not unrestricted guest access. Another thing that a lot of people find is you connect in and you can't stream, or you can't put together a VPN connection back to your government agency using their guest Wi-Fi. Why? Because that means that they can't monitor what you're doing, because those connections are encrypted. And like Chris and I were discussing prior to this, there are legal precedents set already in the court system that says if an agency or organization, or even, and I'm using the most absurd representation here, your dentist's office or your local supermarket, if you connect in there and you go out and you hack somebody's system, your supermarket has been held accountable as a service provider for providing you your internet access that you then went to use to obtain illegal access to somebody else. So just be aware, as a service provider, even the guest network has to have some rudimentary protections on it, or you could be held liable as a service provider, even though you said it was just for guest access, and they, this little thing pops up. What's the one thing that you can take to the bank about those security warning pop-ups? Chris, what is a almost 100% sure bet when you provide that security access banner?
Sorry,
what can you be guaranteed? Well, I'll tell you, it's that nobody will read it.
Yes, that's right.
So you can provide all you want, Don't do this and don't do this and don't do this. Click
go
OK.
Away. I want my account. Go away.
Right,
go away.
Right. I want internet. Blah blah blah. Okay, I get internet. So you can't rely on those warning banners either. So
it could be you could put on that warning banner. We have your first child and $1,000 of cash.
Yep.
People
Arm and a leg, and people are going to click OK. And that is a common practice. I will use us as an example. We had a log-on warning banner for over a year that had misspelling in it, that referred to documents that didn't exist, that in it actually said, if you're doing this and giving it to somebody that's that's asking for this, then ask them to do this. It literally was somebody's copy and paste that they put in there, the engineers inserted into the environment, and then for over a year, not even the IT providers read it for accuracy. I did. And, I raised a real ruckus about it. I said, this can't be there. Oh, well, that's what these guys gave us. So I had to go back to those guys and interview them all. It's not my job, but I went back and interviewed them all, and they said, no, we didn't do that. I said, have you read it? And they said, yeah, it looks like junk. I said, okay, so how do we get it fixed? I don't know, it's not us. And these other guys were like, well, these guys gave it to us. These guys said, no, we didn't. So finally, I took the initiative. I had nothing to do with it. I was service desk. I was a contractor, for God's sake. And I said, we need to change this. So the change request, I told you about this, Chris. The change request went in, and it said, Scotty Ward wants us to change this. You guys, you're not paying attention. So anyway, those security banners, pet peeve. So let's go to the next one. Choose your own device, CYOD. Now this one is where there's a lineup, if you will, of devices that the organization provides, but it gives you greater flexibility because, for example, somebody says, I won't use anything but a Mac, but my iPad. You've got to give me an iPad or else I'm going to raise a ruckus and, claim that you guys suck. Well, then what you do is you put together a device solution that contains iPads, and you manage the iPads. So once the user gets a hold of it, though, here's the most important thing to remember is it is maintained by the users. That's a true CYOD. So the organization owns the devices but hands them to the customers, and the customers get to choose which devices they want, Android or iOS or whatever, but it is then up to them to maintain that device. So it's easier for some of them, but it makes a security model more extensive, but again, the responsibility to maintain the device stays with the customers. That's different than the corporate-owned, agency-owned one at the bottom, where the agency retains all capability and therefore all responsibility to manage and maintain devices. So let's go to the third one here, COPE, corporate-owned, personally enabled. Now, users are unlikely to want to carry two phones. This is very true. Agency-provided devices allows the organization to control the device more, but what it does then is it says, we recognize that there's going to be personal use occurring on this device. And therefore, they make provisions for that within their network, for example, by having the guest network capability. So if you're going to be doing personal use stuff, we've got to design the environment such that your personal use stuff does not intermix with the corporate or agency stuff. Your bytes don't intermix. So it still allows personal use. Now, you don't see COPE environments within the federal government. Any reason why you may think about that, Chris? Why that may occur?
Because it's I have a snarky answer, which would be the federal governments like to control their own things, and they don't want people to do personally own. It's kind of restricted of what they want to do with their personal use of, we have an acceptable use policy, we have all that,
right?
But our personal use is very limited in our acceptable use policy.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of it. The other is that in order to design the infrastructure in such a manner that it will allow that personal use, you're spending government money.
That's right.
For personal access. So the government is not very keen on that. And that's why, that's why many of us carry around 2 phones. Because we get down to the bottom one, which is corporate-owned or agency-owned, whatever you want to call it, and that is where in order to access the wireless networks, you have to have a government-owned or corporate-owned or hospital-owned device. That is easiest to manage, honestly. Why? Because every device has all the restrictions that you want to place on it. However, it makes it difficult when a particular customer asks for a particular thing. Let's say we are starting work with Quest Diagnostic Labs, and therefore we're going to be getting HIPAA information directly from Quest on our devices here, so I can be walking down the hallway and looking at your x-rays. So therefore, you, private hospital, have to be able to establish this encrypted connection to Quest Laboratories so that I can pull it down on my phone. So guess what? You now inherit the added expense of building out your infrastructure to accommodate new requests. So it is indeed the most expensive. You pay for every device, you pay for every connection, you pay for all the wireless stuff, and then you pay for any advancements that occur or new restrictions. It's all paid for by you. And there's the inconvenience of your people having to say, oh, well, no, sorry, honey, you can't call me on this phone because this one doesn't allow private phone calls. You got to call me on my other one. So therefore, I have to carry 2 devices so that I can get a call about daycare or whether the car's ready to be picked up, as well as my calls for my next appointment. So it is very restrictive. It's very expensive, but it allows you to manage and monitor and control everything.
Some of the more restrictive agencies don't even let you bring your own personal phone in the building itself. Mm-hmm. They either tell you to keep it in your car, or they have a locker that says you store it in your locker. You have a key, usually a quarter or something, pass along kind of situation.
Yep.
And just something to be aware about. When you go and apply to different careers, everybody, I've talked to my wife and said, hey, if I end up in one of those jobs, what will be our communication plan? And that's something you probably want to discuss with your family if you end up being considered for one of those careers is what's going to be your communication plan, and figure that part out.
Yep, very true. I have thought about that because I have been in that environment. I was in the Pentagon on 9/11 when everybody grabbed a hold of their cell phones simultaneously, and they saturated the cell towers, and therefore nobody's phone worked. Nobody. There were, 20,000 of us standing in the Pentagon South parking. Beep, 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 beep. Nobody could contact their families. So just something to be aware of. That's why, I don't know if you saw it when you were in the office, Chris, that's why I have a turned off handheld radio, ham radio, at my office. Well, actually, Donald just shipped it back to me. But I kept my own ham radio and got licensed so that I can have another possible alternative in case there's an emergency and the other avenues are not allowed. Here's another thought, and this was actually in the study guide, talked about it. Let's say you're doing even a government-owned let's say government-owned network And you have somebody that says, I want to have my iPad. But what happens if it's in a classified area? Guess what you have on your iPad? You have a camera. And cameras are prohibited from certain restricted areas. So you're like, I got to take my iPad. No, you don't. But it's government provided. But it's got to, how do you reconcile those two? So there are capabilities like the STIGs you were talking about, Chris. STIGs say this thing is disabled in the operating system if it is STIG protected.
The STIG itself actually says not only you disable the camera, you disable the radio that controls the camera, and it's going to go into your discussion questions down below.
Yep. Yep. So those are the four various ways to connect. The two most common are corporate-owned, agency-owned, tightest controls, highest expense, and least risk. The bring your own device, least expensive, most risk, but less expensive, and higher risk. So you have to balance those when you're putting this together. So here are some of the features that you should take into account when you are putting together your mobile device capability. And I'm not going to read all of these, but I'm just going to sort of skim through them. One is application management. In other words, let's say, I'm going to use this again, what's the number one thing you can do on these guys? You can go out to the App Store and download your favorite, My Little Pony screensaver. There's a story about My Little Pony screensavers. But anyway, you can download your screensaver with your family photo album or your favorite, whatever game, or the tool that you want to use, your voice recorder. Oh yeah, these things record voice. They've got a microphone. So how do you, as the service provider, reconcile that when you have application management? You can actually set up, and our agency has done this, you set up a separate application storage area. You can't download from Apple's storage, but you can download from our copy of Apple storage, where we have examined all the things that we put out there and determined that they are not security risks. So you can't download everything, but you can download the things that you need, and they go through a certification examination process. Let's say you want Waze. You want to be able to do your own GPS solution. Well, there are ways to do that, but it has to go through the separate certification process. It's expensive, but you can do it. That's called application management. The next one, content management, and that is where organizational data and BYOD data can exist on the same device. Content management locks away the business data and does not lock away the personal data. The challenge to that, obviously, is in storage space. Also, and we're going to get to this, there are other ways to do this, but just because it's on, let's say, my privately owned iPad does not mean that the government doesn't own the space that's in it. And that gets into some real big privacy issues, because I own this, but my agency owns this storage on this, and then is subject to laws dealing with agency data. And we'll talk about that as we move forward. Remote wipe capability. Remote wipe capability. This is a biggie. It's very prevalent. And it is basically where, if I manage these solutions and let's say a device gets stolen, I drop it in my cab at the airport. I call into my help desk and I say, my device was stolen. Well, lost or stolen. The help desk, if you have enabled remote wipe capability, the help desk can then say, wipe that device. And it reaches out over the internet, finds the device, and issues a command that the device then takes into account and wipes itself. You have basically turned the device into a brick. It cannot be accessed, all the data is gone, and you write off the expense of that device. So, what happens if somebody discovers, oops, oh, it was in this pocket. Sorry, can you turn it back on? What's the answer? Not without going through an entire reallocation and reassignment and formatting that device. Mm-hmm. But you can do it remotely. The device management that we use can do that. We can wipe and then reformat devices remotely. So it's a pretty good capability. Next one, geolocation and geofencing. And we talked about this in some of our other sessions. There's what's called IP address ranges that are specific to certain geographic areas. And for example, China or North Korea or whatever, some of these, especially more managed geographic areas, Iran, Iraq, they actually keep certain IP ranges so that if they have to, they can turn off that IP range and it doesn't go out to the internet because all of their borders are managed and controlled. So you can also use that in a reverse manner and say we want to prohibit access to devices that are in that geographic area. For example, let's say your secretary of whatever or your CEO decides to fly to, oh, I don't know, the Philippines and attend a seminar there. Your mobile device, or I'm sorry, your enterprise management blocks all IP ranges from within the Philippines. That's called geolocation and geofencing. The geolocation is, if I'm going there, we have to specifically allow this device the capability to transmit and receive when it's in that particular IP range. Okay? Geofencing is kind of a reverse of that, and that is where if your particular device is seen trying to initiate connections from within a geofenced IP range, it is automatically prohibited. So it's not just international travel, it's geofencing travel as well. So just be aware that is a capability that exists out there. You have to learn how to manage to that to make sure that you don't block your CEO unintentionally when he decides that he wants to go to the Maldives Islands for, you know, his vacation, and you've geofenced the Maldives. So you can do it, but it requires your diligence to make sure that you are not causing disruption by doing so. Chris, any understanding on that one?
You hit it right on the head.
Okay. Mm-hmm. All right. Here's another one, screen locks, passwords, and PINs. A lot of people don't understand this, but there are usually multiple levels of passwords that can be enacted for a particular device, especially a mobile device. For example, I'm going to use I'm not even going to show the screen on it, but let's say I have a Surface Pro that's owned by my government agency, and it is. In order to get into the BIOS for this, I have to have a particular password. Not my password. It's a BIOS password. In order for me to get into the operating system, I have to have a passcode or a password that is separate from my enterprise password. If I want to connect to the VPN, I have to have capabilities and password encryption or whatever enabled that allow me to connect into that. Then when I get to my enterprise, I have to have an enterprise password for that. Now, just to say, Chris, sometimes you only see one or two of those. It is possible to extend your enterprise capability into those areas, but it is also possible to restrict those particular areas so that you need a particular different password to get to each one of those. So, we have some of those enabled, some of those are extended, but you can have various ones. For mobile devices, there, especially iOS devices, there is a device password, and then there is an access password. And they are different, and you're not supposed to use the same one. Of course, they can't tell that each other is being used or not, because they are so segregated. But, for example, our iOS devices used to have a device password just so you could get off your screen, but then you'd have to have an access password so you could get into the VPN or the wireless networks. It wasn't one password, it was two. And that is what's called, using screen locks, passwords, and PINs. Also, a lot of people aren't aware of this. Well, I can use this one as an example. I'm not going to use that one. These have biometric readers. You can, in some cases, and I'm trying to find it here, in this case it's the power button. You can enable biometrics in the form of fingerprint recognition to the power button. So you can enact biometrics. We're getting to that one as well when we get down there. But you can have a PIN or biometric. And then you can also have a screen lock with a password. So multiple layers, and the important thing is they all add to security, but they all make things more complex for your customers. So you have to apply a balance. Don't turn everything on. You will soon find yourself looking for a job because you've made it to where your people can't work. So biometrics, here's the other one. And I was just showing you that. Biometrics in the form of a I don't have any other biometrics that I want to show here. But you can, enable password recognition, iris recognition, whatever. Biometrics are capable as well for mobile devices. Context-aware authentication. That is where it basically says, what are you trying to get access to? And some of the behavioral elements are such things as, why are you trying to access this at 2 a.m.? I will give you an example of that. I mistakenly stayed connected to my government VPN while I conducted one of these training sessions. And we go through freeconferencecall.com for our VPN, for our webinars. And I was approached Monday morning. They emailed me and CC'd the CISO and said, Mr. Ward, we want to ask you, what were you doing Saturday morning at 9 a.m. trying to access our VPN and get to freeconferencecall.com? And I explained it to them, and I said that was my bad. I should have disconnected from the VPN. because they had context-aware authentication. Or at least they flagged me. They flagged me and said, let's investigate this afterwards. So that's just something to think of. Containerization, it basically has, like we were saying before, one area is secure and managed, one area is not. Very similar to the other one we were talking about where we said content management. It is a form of content management. Storage segmentation is another means of providing personal and business data separately managed. Some of these are very, very similar and have similar names. So make sure when somebody offers this, you know exactly what they're referring to. For example, they could encrypt your container, or they might not encrypt your container, which gets to the next one, which is full device or full disk encryption. Like it says here, the best way to ensure that lost or stolen data is not breached or exfiltrated unintentionally is full disk encryption. The fast way to describe that is basically I connect using my, let's say, my enterprise login and password. This examines the login and password. I'm not on my VPN. I'm not connected to a wireless network. I'm at home doing my homework. But I logged into this government-owned, this isn't government-owned, but let's say I logged into the government-owned system using my enterprise login and password. It contains a little microkernel that will examine that and say, is this authorized to unencrypt and access the portions of this that are FDE encrypted? Yes, it is. Okay, so there we go. So login and password or the biometrics or whatever, enable that to be done. But let's say somebody steals it and they try and access it and it doesn't work. They cannot get to this device capability. Also, if I am connecting in across an enterprise connection, it does that same measurement and says, is this device accessed by this customer allowed to access our networks and storage and data? And the answer is yes, in an FDE environment. Just so you know, full disk encryption is mandatory for any federal government agency or organizations doing business with the government. In other words, if your data is being transferred back and forth, you have to have full device encryption in your own corporate enterprise. If you're a contractor like Lockheed Martin doing business with the government, Lockheed Martin has to incorporate a full disk encryption routine if they're doing any data transfer back and forth with the federal government. So you have to think about that as well. You say, well, we don't want to use full disk encryption. Well, sorry, we do business with the federal government. We must do, it's the law, we must do full disk encryption. So here's another one, and then we're going to get into the questions. And it's talking about push notifications. They say, well, what's the big deal about push notifications? You can use a push notification to tell somebody, by the way, this device has been reported stolen. Don't try and log into it. Turn it into your local police station. That's a deterrent for somebody who's trying to get to your device. All of a sudden it pops up and says, by the way, we know this is stolen, or whatever. That's where they're talking about the push notifications. Also, you can track, and say this device is being tracked. The tracking occurs on one of those other options up there, but you can use the push notification to say, we know there's where this device is. Turn it in. So that's what they mean by push notifications. It's basically to make the bad guy go, uh-oh, and get rid of it. Throw it away or whatever. So that's something to think about. So anything else you have in mind on this, Chris, before we move on?
One of the caveats you need to be aware of is this is not 100% prevent the bad guy from doing the bad things. If the bad guy really wants your information, they're going to go through all avenues. For example, the full disk encryption. Some of the newer techs will sit there and go, well, if we're full disk encrypted, nothing's going to happen, and the bad guy can't do anything. That's wrong. You can YouTube some interesting things and learn how to break that encryption if they absolutely want to do it. That's meant to be there for the people who are less motivated and they're more scared about being caught, if anything. Trust me, if North Korea wants our devices, they would figure a way out to get to our devices. That's the way the cat and mouse game works.
Right. And password complexity is another really good description of that. If somebody wants to get to your password, then and they have the resources to do so, then they're going to get to it. So you have to be aware that what you're providing is sufficient deterrence so that people will choose not to go after you. For example, DOD. A lot of people don't try and go against DOD because DOD is highly incentivized toward deterring. They publish all of their security restrictions and all of their device protections and all this sort of stuff. Why? So that people will understand, well, maybe it'll be easier for me to get to Costco. If I want to play around and steal data, I'll steal from Costco rather than the Department of the Air Force, for example. It's a deterrence. Yep.
And I think that private businesses need to adopt that. That's just my own Chris Oxford soapbox opinion. So,
So, very good. So here's a question. When a smart thief, I say a smart thief, tries to steal your data, they'll take your mobile device and immediately place it into airplane mode or drop it into a Faraday bag. Now, do you know what a Faraday bag is, Chris?
Yes.
Okay, a Faraday bag.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you. They hear me all the time.
The specially designed bag, it blocks away a radio signal. All your cellular phone is a radio signal that goes in and out, and people can remote in ways if they need to do updates, good or bad. What a Faraday bag does is it has specially designed materials to prevent those radio waves from hitting the phone, and you can prevent things from happening.
Okay. Very
remotely.
Good. Yep. So airplane mode turns off all external wireless capability. Turns off Bluetooth, turns off near field, turns off Wi-Fi, turns off your cellular signal. It isolates that device. A Faraday bag does the exact same thing. It isolates the device from any external radio communication. Yes?
The difference between the two is airplane mode only shuts off a certain amount. There's still that one, and I forgot the name of the one radio signal that the cellular providers use. But the Faraday bag cancels everything out pretty much.
Okay.
If I remember correctly.
Okay. Curious. That's good to know. But why would a bad guy do that?
To prevent the remote wiping or to prevent things from bad things from their side from happening.
Yep. Yeah, that's the other thing. What if I'm a bad guy and I carry it into a well-protected environment that has all sorts of triggers so that I don't get hacked, and now I'm bringing this whatever into my own enclave? I'll trigger myself. Good point. But yeah, it's to stop somebody from remotely wiping it or turning it into a brick. Yep. Good. Next question. What can you do as a service provider when your users try to bypass your safeguards by rooting or jailbreaking their devices? Now, rooting or jailbreaking. You want to tell me what that basically means?
Your cellular provider provides a certain configuration for your cell phone, and rooting it is bypassing the configuration, or actually why they call jailbreaking, breaking away from the jail of the configuration of the cell phone. All your cell phone configuration is what you see on your screen and how it works and all that. If you want certain applications, like if you want to start developing on a cell phone, some people will suggest jailbreaking it. I don't develop on mobile devices, not my cup of tea, but pretty much it's you're trying to go into the actual system configuration of your cell phone, bypassing what blocks what the jail is the cellular provider has.
Right. So as a provider, how would you deal with rooting or jailbreaking devices if somebody wanted to do it?
From my knowledge, what the providers do, they flat out tell you that if you do that, if you try to return it and say my phone's broken, sorry, you're fully responsible. You basically broke the warranty. There's not anything physical preventing you from doing it, but considering they play the cost game on that one, my last phone cost about $500, $600. They're way up there now. If you break your cell phone and you bring it back to your ISP, it's going to cost you a lot more money because they're not going to replace it, and the replacement policy is null and void since you jailbreak it. Right.
Yeah, exactly. But also from let's say, your corporation, and you're trying to do a BYOD approach, but if somebody has jailbroken, I think that's the word, their phone, they have bypassed certain things which could cause that phone to not receive security updates. Therefore, that phone becomes a security risk, or a mobile device becomes a security risk. So, usually the providers prohibit jailbroken phones or rooted phones, devices, and have something within their environment that if somebody tries to connect, it looks for certain signatures that are prevalent in or evident in jailbroken phones. And it can tell if your phone has been jailbroken. So, yeah, that's exactly right. Jailbreaking and rooting basically means that there's no way to promise that it will get security updates, so therefore you have a good reason to prohibit it from your environment. It's an added risk. So, for our last few minutes, let's discuss this. You have to cooperate with and not violate laws such as intellectual property. Let's start with intellectual property. Intellectual property basically means, I'll just say I came up with something that was fabulous, a new way of, a new mouse design. And I took my patent, because I got a patent on it, and I put my patent information and design information into my mobile device, and then I go to work at my local, dairy association or whatever, and somebody breaks in and steals that. The dairy association that did not adequately protect my intellectual property can be held responsible for the loss of costs, my revenue costs, because they didn't provide a secure network. Another one, and here's something to consider very seriously. Intellectual property is not a universally agreed to concept. The communists and many socialist countries and many authoritarian countries do not agree that intellectual property rights exist. Okay? For example, let's say I'm an engineer and I develop a brand new design for my mouse, but I live in China, the People's Republic of China. Well, somebody's going to turn around to me and say, thank you for helping the People's Republic of China, and you will get no money from your patent. You can't even file a patent in China, as I understand it. Here's the other thing. Let's say I do it in America, and some Chinese business goes out there and tries to steal my data, steal my patent information, and clone my devices over in China and sell them back to America. I catch that, and I say, oh no, I'm suing that Chinese business. The Chinese government says they didn't break any laws, because the Chinese don't agree that intellectual property laws apply. So you've got to be very, very careful. Intellectual property is not universally agreed to.
It's a jurisdiction issue as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Seem to remember Yahoo had pictures of Nazi paraphernalia, and the United States felt it should have been censored and should have been taken down. The judge came back and said, yeah, if the server's in the United States, and that's fine, that's great and wonderful, but since the server's in France, and France don't view our censorship in history as much as they do, sorry, there's nothing we can do about that.
Right. Yeah.
So that's a case study in the CIS book.
Well, you're actually dealing with a third environment here. I talked intellectual property. We're about to do FOIA, but you're talking about using how local laws apply to an international communication medium, and that's a sticky point, because what happens if your data just happens to travel through that country, and that country says, oh no, we don't allow left-handed people to, submit information or whatever. They could do it. And guess what? I'm left-handed, so I am now breaking the law in the Republic of whatever-istan because my bytes traversed that country. Or some kid was viewing my bytes on his home computer in that country. Indecency laws and legislative requirements, and what is considered to be legal here is not legal here. Big deals when you get to the international global communications medium of the internet. Here's the other one I wanted to talk about, Freedom of Information Act, because we're on our last couple of minutes, Chris. The federal government and all of its, legislative branch, executive branch, judicial branch, whatever, are owned by who? Who owns the federal government?
It's our people. It's our federal government. So they have the right to information. They have the word. I don't like using the word right to know. It has different meanings in different places, but they can file what's called a Freedom of Information Act request to gather information about what the government's doing and making sure their money, making sure the people's money, or whatever the taxpayer, what they call it, taxpayers' dollars, is being allocated correctly and spent correctly, and not doing anything wasteful.
Right. Fraud, waste, and abuse, or illegal activities are a big deal in the federal government. And there is what's called the Freedom of Information Act, which gives the American citizens access to any information in the federal government that has not been classified, and in some cases, some classified information. So what that means, and I'm going to use this as an example, and we use device segmentation, let's say. So this much of the device, or let's say 3/4 of the device, is mine. and I've got my own stuff in here, my own games, my own, stuff from my university, my photos of my grandkids, whatever, is this. Well, this much, because I use it in a BYOD environment where they segment, not BYOD, but a segmented environment where the federal government owns the data that's here, this data is subject to the access restrictions and what's it called? Seizure rights that are guaranteed in the Freedom of Information Act. It is possible, though it's not very likely, but it is possible if you are using a private device to access government or government-controlled organizations or networks, and somebody files a Freedom of Information Act request out there that ends up in resulting in a subpoena and a data hold requirement, it is possible that your personal device can be subpoenaed even though you had absolutely nothing to do with what they're trying to find out. Okay? Just so everybody knows that. The FBI could arrive at your home and take your device away from you legally, and there's nothing you can do about it. All right? So just be aware of that. From a Freedom of Information Act, and there are other legislations as well, this is just the big daddy of them all, that say government-owned information is owned by the people of the United States, and the people have a right to request to see it, even if it's on your privately owned system.
There are certain exemptions, though.
Sure there are.
I'll make that very clear.
Sure there are. But I'm going to the nth degree here and saying it is possible. It is conceivable, though probably not very likely. Mm-hmm. Okay? So last thing I just wanted to end with, and this has nothing to do with anything what we're doing. This came from Simon Sinek. It's likely that if you're having trouble understanding somebody, then somebody else in the room is as well. Asking questions doesn't mean you're the stupidest person in the room. It usually means you're the only one brave enough to speak up. That's why I'm okay being the idiot. In your learning environment, asking questions is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign that you're intelligent enough and diligent enough to make sure that nothing passes you by and you say, well, I'll learn about that later. And then you forget. So always ask questions. And this guy, Simon, gives this example. He was in a room full of C-level executives of a particular corporation. And all these slides were going up on the screen. And he got to a point where he said, excuse me, but I'm sorry I'm slowing this meeting down, but I don't understand what that is up on the screen. And he said, one by one, every single C-level executive in that room finally admitted, well, you're right, I don't know what that means either. And it was about ready to pass them all by, and yet these C-level executives were going to decide whether it was worth the money to spend or whatever, whether it satisfied the business requirements, but they didn't know what it meant. But none of them had the guts to ask. So, he puts it in that fashion, and he said, and Chris, I think we've been in meetings where we've talked about this. I don't mind at all playing the dumb guy card. I don't know what that is.
I don't know what that is either, and honestly, I got to the point, Scotty, that if they're going to fire me over asking a bunch of questions, they're lost.
Yeah. Don't.
The other part is, if I have that question, I am 100% sure either A, someone else in the room has that question, or
Right.
B, the end user is going to ask it, because I was an end user before I came over to that side of the IT.
Yep.
So.
Yep. So don't feel bad about asking questions. In the end, everyone around you could acknowledge that they too were having the same issue.
I had a colleague that came to me and go, "Hey, do I sound like I'm an idiot when I'm asking questions? I'm trying not to be, and I don't want people upset at me." And I go, "Hey, so-and-so, I don't want to release this person's name because I think you're still recording, but
No. Oh, yes, I am. Let me end the recording. Now, just finish your example. Don't use names.
Yes. So the person came to me and goes, "Hey, I feel like someone's going to yell at me, asking all these questions and making me feel like an idiot." And I go, "Bill, I had the same questions. I just couldn't formulate the words."
Right.
I'm sorry, I said his name, but he felt very well about that. And I go, "You got to ask questions, because if you don't ask those questions, someone else has those same questions, and we're all going to look like idiots in the end and get yelled at for it. But if we ask that question, we now know what's going on."
Yep. Very good. Okay. I think we're all done. Thank you very much, Chris, for your help in this, and I hope that the viewers will get some value out of this. Remember, this is Cybersecurity Sensei. This is not training. We're trying to give you the mindset of a service provider so that you will be valuable to the people that are looking to hire you in the first place. So.